Constitutional Enforcement Pre-Study Materials, Part 6. The question naturally arises, if we can't transgress against them, and they can't trespass against us, how can we enforce anything against the other parties? While there is a decided and hard boundary to be observed, it is a boundary, fixed in time and space. The boundary of Washington, D.C., within which the municipal government is allowed to operate its plenary oligarchy, is fixed and encompassed by boundary stones. The boundaries of the territorial government are fixed, too, through more widespread and varied. From 1 mile inward from the edge of the sea or any truly navigable inland waterway, the Brits can meet and mingle and enforce their jurisdiction to the extent allowed by their actual territorial constitution. The federal courts have a 12-mile diameter safety zone around them that comprises their dry dock area. The actual military installations and naval stations, armories, and so forth are also established within boundaries. The buildings occupied by post offices are federal safety zones. There are a few other common examples, but when federales step outside these granted federal safety zones defined and limited as they were in 1860, they are on our turf and may be arrested for cause and taken into custody by our sheriffs and our continental marshals. If a public law was violated, the sheriffs and/or continental marshals present the cause for arrest to one of our grand juries. If they agree that trespass or another crime has been committed, the grand jury issues an indictment. If they are acting against one of our own state citizens, it's called a presentment, and the prisoner is either held pending transfer to a federal authorities for federal offenses, we caught one of theirs breaking their law on our turf, or paroled, for minor and nonviolent issues, or, if a public law has been violated and an American injured on our turf, the case will be tried under American common law by one of our courts, except that military and diplomatic personnel must always be bound over for trial by their respective courts. Thus, the physical location of where a crime is committed determines, for the most part, which court has jurisdiction. So long as our courts are operating, our courts take jurisdiction outside the limited areas officially set aside for federal use. The second thing to look at is, what's the political status of the offender? Are they an American or are they some sort of U.S. citizen, either territorial or municipal? The third thing to consider is, what kind of law was broken? Did they violate public law, meaning the Ten Commandments, the United States statutes at large, the constitutions or any other organic law? If a federale comes onto our land and murders one of us in one of our counties, we can arrest him, we can try him, and we can hang him. Now, the federales won't like that, but that's the facts. Once our counties are repopulated on paper and our civilian courts are operating, we have the absolute right to enforce our law in our dominions. What if a federale comes into one of our counties and commits a federal crime, a crime against a state statute, or federal code, or military regulations, and we catch him at it? Well, it's not our citizen and it's not our law, but it happened on our ground. It isn't a violation of our public law. It's just an infraction of their statutory laws that we witnessed. So, we make the arrest and report the crime. And turn the rat over to federal authorities for prosecution. We are not competent to interpret or speak to their codes, statutes and regulations, but we often have reasonable and probable cause to believe that a crime occurred. In such a case, we have a duty to assist them, just as they have a duty to assist us. We do our part by making the arrest and acting as witnesses, and then we turn the suspect over to federal authorities. They take it from there. But that doesn't quite describe the situation, does it? If it is a matter covered under delegated powers, we turn the suspect over to the U.S. Marshals. If it's not covered under delegated powers and is still occurring in international jurisdiction, it's covered under the 10th Amendment, reserved powers, and we turn the suspect over to our continental marshals. So, 1, 2, 3. Where did the crime happen? Who or what committed the crime and what was their political status? What form of law was violated? Let's fast forward and assume that all our counties and states are fully repopulated with Americans who are knowingly claiming back their political status and assets, acting as state citizens, and operating their American civilian courts. A federal employee comes into Laughlin County, Missouri, and murders his ex-wife, an American civilian. A neighbor who is a state citizen and member of the militia catches him in the act and makes the citizen's arrest on the spot. He turns the suspect over to the county sheriff, who brings the witness testimony before one of our grand juries, and the grand jury issues the indictment. This man has broken the public law on our turf, so except for the case of actual diplomats or military personnel, he is bound over to our civilian court. In a case like this, federal employees are required to not only obey all their codes and statutes, but also to obey the public law that stands over all the legislative and administrative claptrap. Our public prosecutor stands up for the victim, because the victim can't be present herself. The facts and the law are presented to our jury. Our jury concludes its findings. Our judge pronounces the sentence. Our sheriffs carry it out. Does everyone clearly and absolutely understand that public law trumps private law at all times, except in the case of actual foreign diplomats and military personnel? So when it comes to actual crime resulting in actual harm to living people occurring on our turf, whose jurisdiction is it? Ours. It's our responsibility to address any violation of the public law and any issue not specifically delegated to the federal subcontractors. And what have we learned about the delegation of powers to federal subcontractors? Well, for high points, we learned that the municipal government is operating out of school and shouldn't even be present on our soil, and that the territorial government is remiss for allowing that situation. The military has mistaken the civil government for the civilian government accidentally on purpose, and that has resulted in the unauthorized, unconstitutional proliferation of municipal courts and municipal governmental services organizations operating on our soil. All that needs to be shut down and the municipal government returned to its boundaries within the District of Columbia. We also learned that our own federal states of states are missing in action, and for the time being anyway, we are responsible for addressing all the issues that were once upon a time delegated to them. Although there are federal codes and there are state statutes addressing such issues as interstate bank fraud, neither the territorial government nor the municipal government are strictly responsible for enforcement. Just like incorporated county sheriffs, they can use their discretion as to whether or not to enforce laws that aren't strictly their responsibility, and whenever it has suited them to ignore such things as banking or securities laws that are supposed to be the bailiwick of the federal states of states, they have done so. That is why we are awash in illegal foreclosures, other forms of bank, currency, securities, and probate fraud, human trafficking and other evils. Not only is there nobody minding the store, but those we assume to be minding the store for us are being misdirected by self-interested foreign corporation subcontractors. That's why we have all the unelected federal agencies doing enforcement activities, and also why those same federal agencies selectively fail to enforce. The municipal subcontractors have hired all these agencies to do the job we haven't been doing because, 1. Our federal states of states have been mothballed pending reconstruction for 150 years, and 2. We weren't told what was actually going on, so we couldn't take the action we are taking now, and take charge of the situation ourselves. The territorial government's focus is and has always been crimes occurring on the high seas and inland waterways, and military coordination between American land and air forces and British-controlled Navy and Marine forces. They've all been misdirected, too, and employed as cheap mercenaries. The municipal government is supposed to be setting up a nice meeting space for everyone and maintaining law and order inside the Washington, D.C. municipality, not running the country. So, similar to the situation with sheriffs serving incorporated counties being told that they could, if they want to, enforce the constitutions, we can, if we want to, use the Continental Marshal's Service to enforce all the delegated powers that we entrusted to our original federal states of states, duties that the run-amok misdirected federal agencies and municipal government are not competent to address or purposefully don't address, all pending the complete restoration and reconstruction of the government we are owed. Interstate bank fraud, illegal foreclosures, human trafficking, illegally enforced taxation? The municipal government, which has no actual authority to do so, has hired federal agency subcontractors to do the work of our federal government and then misdirected the agency personnel. So, while we have depended on the FBI and DHS and all these alphabet soup agencies, they have all been operating without any actual authority, without proper oversight, and they have often been misled and misdirected by corporate power brokers intent on making profit and actually breaking the law. In many cases, as we have seen, these agencies have contributed to the problems and have been acting lawlessly on our shores. The FBI, IRS, BATF, BLM, FCC, and SEC are prime offenders. The municipal government doesn't have any actual authority to grant to these agencies and has been running them as private, for-profit, business operations. You see the problem? So, now, you are getting a feeling for the scope of the problem and where you can serve as part of the solution to it. Let's talk a little about how we can identify where our turf begins and their turf ends. In recent years, the municipal government, which has no business operating outside its limited boundaries and for its limited purposes within the District of Columbia, has been going around arbitrarily making claims of federal interest in school properties, county and state facilities, contract postal service stations, hospitals, universities and wherever any federal money has been invested. However, for these claims to have any validity, the actual state must have officially granted the land to the federal government, and no such action has been taken. Thus the gross federal overreaches and attempts to extend federal zones fall flat upon investigation and demand to see evidence that any actual state, not state of state, ever granted the land in question, and also fail the test of being used exclusively for a designated and enumerated federal purpose. When the British territorial states of states secretively substituted themselves for our missing federal states of states in the 1860s-1906, they made merry making all sorts of land grants to groups and institutions they favored. Some of what was done was intended to be good and not merely payback for cronies. For example, they established land-grant universities that have not only built their campuses on the land granted to them by territorial state-of-state organizations acting for us, but have developed and/or sold off land originally granted to them for profit supporting their programs. There are many examples of public campgrounds, summer youth camps, state parks, recreational facilities, swimming pools, historical sites, public gardens, libraries, and other worthy efforts being funded or partially supported by land grants made at this time. Still, the fact remains that all these organizations substituting for us were largely operating on the premise that a non-existent emergency provided them with the authority to do all these things and make all these investments in our names, and that is simply untrue. These actions were taken by small groups of political and social activists, largely British sympathizers of the Fabian persuasion, who found a backdoor means to gain an unauthorized position of stewardship over our assets. Polite pirates, in other words. For purposes of establishing court jurisdiction and enforcement authority, these land grants still belong to the actual states, and the investment of federal money does not change that. Another pregnant issue is the status of the Western states formed after the Civil War. They have never been formally enrolled as states, because there was no land jurisdiction Congress called to confirm them. Thus, they have been operated as possessions, as in territories and possessions, even though they are owed full status as states. This is why their land assets have not been transferred to state control as mandated by the organic law, and they have instead been managed under custodial proprietorship by territorial and/or municipal state-of-state organizations. Nonetheless, when the actual landlords appear, the federal employees need to stand down. The statehood compacts stand over any custodianship or foreign state-of-state authority. This is the issue underlying the Oregon Wildlife Refuge standoff, and it affects all the Western states. Any hostile action taken by any federale against any state citizen in the Western states is a trespass, whether or not those states are under a federal proprietorship. Obviously, our sheriffs and our continental marshals must be giving due consideration and studying up on these and similar issues and historical circumstances to rightly determine where federal, especially territorial, jurisdiction begins and ends on the ground. They will be greatly aided in this once the Bar Association shackles are loosened, our courts reopen all across the country, and more former bar attorneys and paralegals become available to assist with such questions. The military judicial district ploy was such a success that the run-amok federal corporations have tried their hand at creating all sorts of districts, historic districts, water and soil districts, school districts, etc., 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 but all comes down to the same thing. They have been acting for us and in our names, while we are perfectly competent to act for ourselves, and doing this is not part of their contract. As such, it is a usurpation upon our authority and often results in totally unauthorized spending that takes place without fiduciary responsibility or restraint. Thus the good accomplished is counterbalanced by the evils of unaccountable and merely presumed to exist trusteeship, one of the problems which is likely to be a very common complaint until the dead baby scam is shut down and so-called international service providers are made aware of the limits of their authority and the accountability they owe to the American states and people. Much of the great evil we face is simply ignorance, and business affairs run wildly askew because foxes, especially bankers and military contractors, have been allowed access to the hen house by political lobbyists substituting themselves for sober and accountable financial fiduciaries. This country has not enjoyed a normal course of business since 1865, and it went completely off the map in the 1930s. So much of what we face involves probate, bonding, insurance, and securities fraud, purloined escrow accounts and assets, and damage caused by unlawful conversion and illegal asset stripping, embezzlement, illegal foreclosures, bank and currency fraud, counterfeiting, currency and commodity rigging, and other forms of serious white-collar crime. Those who have been acting as our agents and running this rock pile have prosecuted their competitors with great zeal and turned a very blind eye to their own sins against us. So another aspect of the work set before the Continental Marshals and United States Marshals especially, is to interface with the military as we negotiate the end of the military protectorate that has been foisted off on us for 6 generations in lieu of our own government. While I am thinking of it, I also want to remind everyone that actual states have physical, geographically defined boundaries. States of states do not. States of states are called inchoate or incomplete states because they have no material substance of their own. They are business and service organizations, either corporate, that is, unincorporated, or incorporated. Another point about state identity and structure is that actual states are formed by compact, not by constitutions. Underline that, our states were not created by any constitution. Our states were created by social and political compact. Many Americans are confused and think that their country and their states were created by the constitutions. That's like thinking your house was created by a maintenance contract. Many patriotic Americans get all bound up about the federal constitutions and about the various state constitutions, but from our perspective, the only importance the constitutional agreements have for us are, 1. To uphold our state's actual obligations as stipulated, and 2. To enforce the guarantees and good faith service we are owed. And finally, for this little segment, this is of utmost importance, underline it and remember it the rest of your days, only the actual states are parties to the constitutions. This means that only the actual states of the Union have the right, power, and standing to enforce the constitutions, and only the people, the state citizens, have standing to bring demands and disciplinary action against the federal subcontractors. Every American is owed good faith service from all federal government employees and all federal subcontractors, but it is the actual states of the Union and the people acting in the capacity of state citizens who can put pedal to the metal and put constitutional enforcement into overdrive. It has always been our right and our responsibility, but we didn't know and weren't told how far off course things had gone, and our erstwhile federal subcontractors did nothing to assist and enable their employers. Quite the contrary. Both the Queen and the Pope have collaborated through the instrumentalities of commercial corporations chartered under their auspices, to genocide Americans on paper, and we have clear and convincing evidence that at least some elements in the municipal government intended to genocide us physically, in an effort to get rid of their priority creditors. Nothing that we have discovered would lead me to believe that there is any sincere political agenda involved in any of this. An easy 90% of this is centered on usurpation for the purpose of unjust enrichment, bunco schemes, identity theft, credit fraud, probate fraud, unlawful conversion, trafficking, kidnapping, inland piracy, securities fraud, commodity rigging. It's all about money, not politics, and it's crime, not politics, driving it. So, the call has gone out and the witchfires have been lit. Americans are shaking off the dust, and are straightening out their own deliberately falsified provenance and political status records. The actual states are assembling for the first time in 150 years. The national militia is organizing. The actual military will side with us. The U.S. Navy is going to figure out that the Queen is acting under our delegated authority, and anything she orders that harms us is 1. Gross breach of trust, 2. Grossly illegal, and 3. They are liable for following criminal orders, just like the Nazi jocks at Nuremberg. The Marines are going to shake awake, too. The jarheads have been shouting, "I am an American," every morning for generations. When they figure out that foreign subcontractors have been misdirecting them and defrauding the folks back home, there's going to be hell to pay. The army, God bless them, might be slow, but the mills of God grind very, very fine. And the Air Force won't be far behind. No matter how corrupt the top brass is, there's a magic moment when they realize that enough is enough and we aren't going to take it anymore. Our flag, has been hanging, struck, face down in the Capitol Rotunda for 150 years, for no justifiable reason at all. It's time to change that. Now, if you are like me, you already know that no Yemenis bombed those Saudi oil refineries. You've seen the NATO missiles used to deliver those heavy payloads. You know what to think. And you know that Mr. Trump's harshest sanctions ever against Iran are just a build-up to some nasty false flag on our own soil, or elsewhere, calculated to mislead the American public into war once again. Let me tell you something, Iran hasn't fought a war outside its borders in over 200 years. They aren't the aggressors in this situation, and that's for sure. Our criminal out-of-control foreign subcontractors, the Queen and the Pope, are the aggressors, just as they always have been. And Mr. Trump is, thus far, going along with this like a trained duck. For your information, the Queen and the Pope have been playing the same game since the French and Indian War: get the Americans to fight the war for them, get the Americans to pay for the war for them, and keep the profits for themselves. George Washington thought we should get a cut from it. I think that the Queen and the College of Cardinals should be out there in the field in their bedroom slippers fighting their own battles. Anyway, that quid pro quo, in a nutshell, is why we have been in nearly constant war for 150 years, while Iran has been at peace. That's why our veterans stand on street corners holding signs that say, "Vet in need." It's the moral fault and the greed of our purported friends and allies acting in our names that caused all of this misery, that has undermined our country, that has stolen our bread and our identities and our credit, that has spilled our blood, polluted our country, ruined our currency, and many other ills. Well, use your own heads. If you can't see who our real enemies are and always have been, you really do need a bolt of lightning. We, the American states and people, are not going to suck their toes anymore. We're not going to fall for their big lies and false flags anymore. And we're not going to sit idly by, being fleeced and used for gun fodder, anymore. So, it's time to up anchor and sail. And time for the Joint Chiefs to be fully informed. End Part 6.